During World War II, dinner looked very different inside American homes. Families could not simply walk into grocery stores and buy whatever they wanted. Meat was rationed, butter became expensive and difficult to find. Sugar disappeared quickly from shelves. Fresh ingredients often depended on what local stores happened to receive. For millions of poor American families, survival depended on one important thing: making cheap food stretch as far as possible. And that is exactly why one-pot dinners became so important during the 1940s. These meals were simple, cheap, heavy, and filling. They could feed entire families using very small amounts of expensive ingredients. A single pot often satisfied parents, grandparents, and multiple children. Housewives learned to transform scraps, canned goods, potatoes, beans, and tiny portions of meat into dinners capable of feeding everyone. Some meals looked strange, some sounded depressing, but many became legendary comfort foods remembered for decades after the war ended. Tonight, we are stepping back into wartime America to explore the one-pot dinners that kept poor families alive during World War II. One of the most common one-pot dinners was simple potato and bean stew. Potatoes and beans became survival food during the war years. When meat disappeared, potatoes and beans often became dinner itself. Large chunks of potatoes and dried beans were soaked overnight, and sometimes, if the family got lucky, tiny pieces of bacon or sausage were added for flavor. Not full servings, just enough for richness. The stew usually simmered for hours. The potatoes softened and thickened the liquid, while the beans made the meal heavier and more filling. Every ingredient mattered. For many poor families, this dinner appeared multiple times every single week during the difficult war years. Another popular dinner was macaroni and tomato pot. This was one of the cheapest meals possible because pasta and canned tomatoes remained affordable. Macaroni noodles boiled inside a large pot with canned tomatoes, onions, and sometimes tiny scraps of ground beef. Many mothers intentionally overcooked the pasta slightly because softer noodles made the meal feel more filling. It required little cleanup and fuel. Cabbage became one of the most important survival vegetables. It was cheap, lasted long, and could feed huge families when cooked properly. The cabbage and sausage skillet used shredded cabbage cooked slowly. Small slices of sausage were added carefully, sliced incredibly thin to stretch. A single small sausage could flavor an entire pot, feeding 6 or 7 people. That level of stretching was necessary during wartime. Navy bean soup was legendary. Beans were affordable, stored well, and filled stomachs for hours. Many families used leftover bones for flavor. By dinner time, the beans became soft enough to create a rich, creamy texture naturally without requiring expensive milk or butter. One of the strangest survival dinners was cornmeal mush with gravy. During the 1940s, poor families relied on it because cornmeal remained cheap. The gravy mattered enormously. Families created it using whatever fat remained available, sometimes bacon grease or thin flour gravy with onions. Perhaps no dinner symbolized wartime poverty more than potato soup. It contained little more than potatoes, onions, water, salt, and pepper. Alongside came onion bread or stale bread toasted with grease. Families reused every crust. Nothing went to waste. Despite its simplicity, hot soup made families feel safe during uncertain years filled with war news and financial hardship. During World War II, meals like this kept millions of poor Americans alive, one dinner at a time, a legacy of endurance and survival. During World War II, poor American families became masters of survival cooking. Dinner was no longer about luxury, variety, or presentation. It became about one thing: making sure nobody at the table went to bed hungry. Ration books controlled meat, butter, sugar, cooking oil, and many everyday ingredients. Grocery stores often looked half empty by evening. Mothers planned meals carefully because wasting even tiny scraps of food felt irresponsible during wartime. And that is exactly why one-pot dinners became so important. These meals saved money, saved fuel, saved time, and most importantly, they stretched tiny amounts of ingredients into massive portions capable of feeding entire households. A single onion could flavor an entire dinner. One small piece of meat could feed 6 people if cooked correctly. Even stale bread and leftover vegetables became valuable ingredients instead of garbage. For poor families living through the war years, creativity inside the kitchen became survival itself. And some of the meals Americans invented during this era still exist today because they worked so well during hard times. Tonight, we continue exploring the one-pot dinners that helped poor American families survive. World War II 7. Hoover stew. Few wartime dinners carried a stronger poverty reputation than Hoover stew. The meal originally became famous during the Great Depression, but families continued cooking it during World War II as a cheap way to feed households. Hoover stew was not elegant. It was not beautiful, but it filled stomachs. And during wartime America, that mattered more than appearance. The basic recipe usually included macaroni noodles, canned tomatoes, onions, beans, and sliced hot dogs or sausage when available. Some families skipped meat completely because rationing made it too expensive. Others used tiny meat scraps purely for flavor. The entire meal cooked together inside one massive pot until the noodles absorbed the liquid and everything thickened. Children often describe the dinner as messy, soft, and extremely hot straight from the stove. One fascinating thing about Hoover stew was how different every family made it. Some versions looked like soup, others were thick enough to scoop. Nothing had strict rules because survival mattered more than recipes. Mothers used whatever remained available. For many older Americans, the smell of tomato-based Hoover stew bubbling on the stove became permanently connected with memories of the war. 8. Chicken and dumpling pot. Chicken and dumplings became one of the most comforting one-pot dinners during World War II, but wartime versions looked very different from modern rich meals. Poor families could rarely afford much chicken. Instead, mothers used tiny portions, sometimes only bones or leftover scraps from previous meals to stretch the dish. The magic came from the broth. As the chicken simmered with onions, celery, and carrots, the liquid slowly absorbed flavor. Then came the dumplings. Simple dough made from flour, water, and salt. Small spoonfuls dropped directly into the boiling broth created soft, heavy dumplings that expanded while cooking. And those dumplings mattered enormously, because the dumplings filled stomachs even when there was very little meat. The aroma filling tiny homes during winter evenings created emotional comfort during extremely stressful years. 9. Rice and hamburger skillet. This meal exploded in popularity because rice and ground beef stretched incredibly well together. Ground beef alone could never feed large families during rationing, but mixed with rice and broth, it became enough for everyone. The dinner usually started with onions frying inside a skillet using tiny amounts of saved grease or oil. As the rice absorbed liquid and meat flavor, the dinner thickened naturally into a filling, heavy meal. Women working factory jobs appreciated one-pot dinners because they reduced dishes after exhausting shifts. 10. Creamed corn and potato pot. At first glance, the meal sounded extremely plain, and honestly it often was, but during severe rationing this dinner helped feed families because the ingredients remained relatively affordable. The recipe involved diced potatoes boiled inside a pot alongside canned creamed corn. Children sometimes enjoyed this dinner more because the sweet corn flavor tasted comforting compared to blander survival meals. 11. Lentil and onion soup. Lentils provided cheap protein during meat shortages. During wartime poverty, lentils became lifesavers. As the lentils softened, they thickened the soup naturally into a heavy filling dinner capable of feeding families cheaply. Government posters encouraged Americans to eat protein alternatives like lentils to support wartime rationing efforts. 12. Bread dumpling stew. This meal existed for one reason. Poor families could not afford to waste stale bread. When bread became old and hard, mothers transformed it into dinner instead of throwing it away. The dumplings absorbed liquid and created extremely filling portions. Children joked that bread dumplings felt like eating clouds. Every ingredient stretched as far as possible. These meals quietly helped poor American families survive one difficult dinner at a time.
By the middle of World War II, poor American families had completely changed the way they cooked dinner. Before the war, many households still dreamed about roast meats, fresh desserts, large breakfasts, and full Sunday meals. But wartime rationing slowly erased those expectations. Sugar disappeared quickly. Butter became precious. Meat portions shrank. Cooking oil had to be reused carefully. And grocery shopping itself became stressful because nobody knew what stores would actually have in stock. For struggling families, one-pot dinners became survival machines. These meals could turn leftovers into something new. A single potato could help feed multiple people. One spoonful of grease could flavor an entire pot. Even stale bread and vegetable scraps became valuable ingredients instead of trash. These dinners created warmth during incredibly uncertain years, because during wartime, a giant steaming pot sitting in the center of the table meant something powerful. The family would eat tonight. Tonight, we continue exploring the one-pot dinners that kept struggling families alive during World War II. 13. Cabbage roll pot. One of the smartest survival dinners was the cabbage roll pot. Traditional cabbage rolls contained meat and rice wrapped inside cabbage leaves. But wartime poverty forced families to stretch ingredients. Instead of making individual rolls, many mothers simply turned everything into one giant pot dinner. The recipe used chopped cabbage, tiny amounts of ground beef or sausage mixed with rice, onions, and canned tomatoes. Not much meat. The rice expanded while cooking, helping the meal feel larger and heavier. As the cabbage softened, it absorbed flavor from the tomatoes. Children often complained about cabbage, but once cooked slowly for hours, the vegetable became soft, sweet, and surprisingly comforting. A tiny amount of meat could flavor an entire dinner for 6 or 7 people. That mattered enormously during rationing. Some households served the dinner with thick slices of bread to stretch portions further. Others added potatoes directly into the pot. 14. Tuna noodle pot. During WWll, canned tuna became important because fresh meat remained expensive and difficult to obtain. The meal looked simple: egg noodles, canned tuna, milk or thin cream sauce, and peas. Everything cooked together until thick and creamy. Children liked tuna noodle dinners because they tasted softer and richer than many wartime meals. The sauce made it feel more luxurious. One small can might feed an entire household once mixed with enough noodles. Mothers became experts at making proteins seem larger. Crushed crackers or stale breadcrumbs frequently appeared on top for texture because wasting old bread during wartime felt almost criminal. Factory workers appreciated tuna noodle dinners because they were heavy enough to satisfy hunger after exhausting labor shifts. 15. Potato pancake skillet. Potatoes became one of the greatest survival foods in wartime America, cheap, filling, and easy to store. Potato pancake skillet dinners became common. Shredded potatoes were mixed with onions, flour, and tiny amounts of seasoning. The mixture got flattened into large skillet cakes, cooked slowly using tiny amounts of saved grease. The smell filled kitchens with warmth. Many families served them with gravy made from meat drippings. During hard wartime months, affordability became more important than variety. 16. Bean and cornbread pot. Few dinners symbolize survival more clearly. Beans provided cheap protein when meat disappeared. Cornbread mattered too because cornmeal remained inexpensive. The dinner started with giant pots of beans simmering slowly for hours. Children frequently crumbled cornbread directly into bowls because the bread absorbed flavor and made dinners feel larger. 17. Tomato bread soup. This meal existed because poor families could not afford to waste stale bread. Nothing was thrown away. As the bread softened, it thickened the soup naturally into a heavy stew-like consistency. It filled stomachs surprisingly well. 18. Rice and milk dinner pot. Modern audiences may see this as breakfast, but for poor families, it was a filling dinner. Poorer versions contained only rice, milk, and salt. Warm, soft foods created calmness during uncertain times. During World War II, even the simplest meals carried powerful emotional meaning when they kept families together and fed. As World War II continued, poor American families became incredibly skilled at survival cooking. By that point, many mothers no longer followed exact recipes. They simply looked at whatever remained inside the kitchen and built dinner from scraps. 1 onion, half a cabbage, a handful of potatoes. Leftover grease saved inside a jar near the stove. Tiny pieces of meat stretched carefully across an entire pot. Nothing could be wasted anymore. And because fuel conservation also mattered during wartime, one-pot dinners became even more important. Families wanted meals that cooked slowly in a single pot. These dinners were not fancy. Most looked simple. Some looked downright depressing. But they worked. They kept stomachs full during one of the hardest periods in modern American history. Tonight, we continue exploring the one-pot dinners that helped families survive. 19. Hot dog potato hash. One of the most famous poor family dinners during WWll was hot dog potato hash. The dinner usually started with diced potatoes frying slowly inside a deep skillet using tiny amounts of saved grease. Then onions entered the pan. Finally came sliced hot dogs. Not large amounts. Sometimes only 2 or 3 hot dogs for an entire family meal. As the potatoes browned slightly, the grease and hot dog flavor coated the entire pan, creating a smoky, rich smell that filled tiny kitchens. 20. Wartime goulash. This meal usually combined macaroni noodles, tomatoes, onions, and tiny amounts of ground beef or sausage inside one giant pot. The important part was stretching meat. That is exactly why pasta mattered so much. A single pound of macaroni could transform a small amount of meat. Many older Americans later remembered giant steaming pots of wartime goulash sitting in the center of dinner tables while families discussed ration books. 21. Creamed peas and toast pot. During WWll, countless poor families relied on meals like this because canned peas and bread remained relatively affordable. One fascinating detail about wartime creamed dinners involved milk stretching. Families frequently watered down milk to make it last longer. Warm, soft meals felt calming, and during wartime uncertainty, psychological comfort mattered more than many people realize. 22. Beef and barley soup. Barley became incredibly valuable during rationing because it stretched meat dishes beautifully. As everything cooked for hours, the barley thickened naturally while absorbing rich flavor from the meat. The result became heavy, warm, and deeply filling. 23. Fried cornmeal mush pot. Cornmeal continued playing a huge role in poor wartime kitchens because it remained inexpensive and filling. One older American later described wartime cornmeal dinners by saying, "We were poor, but at least nobody stayed hungry." 24. Vegetable scrap stew. This meal had almost no fixed recipe because its entire purpose involved using leftovers before they spoiled. Government campaigns constantly encouraged Americans to save food, so meals like this became symbols of responsibility and patriotism as much as poverty. During World War II, meals like this quietly helped millions of poor American families survive difficult nights, one bowl at a time. By the later years of World War II, poor American families had entered a completely different relationship with food. Dinner was no longer something people simply cooked. It became strategy. Every ingredient inside the kitchen had value. Every potato mattered. Every spoonful of grease mattered. Every leftover scrap of bread mattered. Mothers learned how to stretch meals farther than most modern families could even imagine. A single chicken could become 3 different dinners. Old soup transformed into stew. Leftover potatoes returned as hash. Stale bread became dumplings, stuffing, or thickener for soup. Nothing disappeared. Nothing got wasted. At the same time, emotional exhaustion had started affecting families across America. Years of rationing, stress, and constant war headlines made comfort food more important than ever. One-pot dinners became emotional survival tools. The smell of soup simmering on the stove, steam covering tiny kitchen windows during winter, families sitting together around one heavy pot. Tonight, we continue exploring the one-pot dinners that saved poor American families during World War II. Poor wartime families had something very different. The meal began with cheap noodles boiled inside a giant pot. Then came thin tomato sauce made from canned tomatoes and tiny amounts of grease. Actual meat often barely existed. Sometimes mothers added tiny beef crumbles, sometimes sliced hot dogs, sometimes nothing at all. But the noodles absorbed flavor beautifully, creating a filling dinner that looked larger than it really was. That illusion mattered enormously during wartime, as onions and tomatoes simmered together. Tiny kitchens filled with aromas that felt comforting and rich even when the family remained poor. Many poor households used garlic heavily because strong flavor helped simple meals taste more satisfying without needing expensive ingredients. Bread almost always accompanied spaghetti dinners, sometimes toasted, sometimes stale, sometimes rubbed lightly with saved grease or garlic water. 26 potato and cabbage boil. A few meals symbolized wartime poverty more clearly than this. Both ingredients remained cheap and easy to store. The recipe looked incredibly simple. Large chunks of potatoes, shredded cabbage, onions, salt, water, or thin broth. As the cabbage softened, it released sweetness while the potatoes thickened the liquid. The result became surprisingly hearty despite using no expensive ingredients. A giant pot of cabbage and potatoes physically looked enormous, helping families feel psychologically secure even when money remained tight. One older American remembered, "We ate cabbage so often the whole apartment building smelled like it." It was a shared experience of survival. 27. Peanut butter potato soup. This combination solved an important problem, creating protein-heavy dinners without expensive meat. Small spoonfuls of peanut butter got stirred into the liquid to create thickness. It melted directly into the broth, creating a creamy texture. 28. Chicken rice stew. This meal stretched poultry incredibly well. Poor families rarely enjoyed large pieces of chicken during the war. As the rice absorbed broth, it expanded and thickened the stew naturally while making tiny amounts of chicken feel much larger. 29. Onion gravy noodle pot. This meal transformed extremely inexpensive ingredients into something warm and filling. Noodles cooked directly inside the gravy until soft and coated completely with onion. Flavor: simple, cheap, heavy, and surprisingly satisfying. 30. Wartime corn chowder. Canned corn remained easier to obtain than many other vegetables during certain rationing periods. Families frequently diluted milk using water to make supplies last longer while still maintaining creamy texture inside soups. And during World War II, comfort mattered almost as much as food itself.
As World War II dragged on, poor American families became experts at turning almost nothing into dinner. People stopped expecting luxury meals. Instead, they focused on survival, fullness, and warmth. A successful dinner during wartime did not need to look beautiful. It simply needed to feed everyone. And because rationing affected nearly every kitchen in America, families learned to rely heavily on cheap ingredients capable of stretching far inside one large pot. Beans, potatoes, rice, cornmeal, cabbage, noodles. These foods became the foundation of survival cooking during the 1940s. At the same time, dinner carried emotional importance too. After exhausting factory shifts and stressful grocery lines, families needed moments of comfort. Tonight, we continue exploring the one-pot dinners that helped poor American families survive World War II. 31. Ham bone bean pot. One of the smartest survival dinners during WW was ham bone bean pot. Poor families understood an important truth during wartime: bones still contained value. Even after most meat disappeared, ham bones still carried flavor. As the soup simmered for hours, the beans softened while the ham bones slowly released smoky flavor into the broth. Children often searched eagerly for tiny pieces of actual ham floating inside the soup because meat had become rare in many poor households. 32. Tomato rice soup pot. This meal became popular because rice and canned tomatoes remained relatively affordable. As the rice absorbed the tomato liquid, the soup thickened naturally into something closer to stew. That mattered psychologically. Thicker meals felt more filling. 33. Wartime shepherd's pot. Instead of using large amounts of beef, mothers stretched tiny portions using potatoes and vegetables. Milk shortages forced many families to mash potatoes using water, broth, or saved grease, instead of butter and cream. 34. Barley vegetable stew. Barley became one of the most valuable survival grains because it stretched soups beautifully while costing very little. As the barley cooked, it absorbed liquid and expanded heavily, turning thin soup into thick filling stew. 35. Creamed potato and onion pot. The meal used incredibly basic ingredients: potatoes, onions, milk or watered-down milk, flour, salt and pepper. Many poor households relied on powdered milk because fresh dairy became difficult to obtain consistently during rationing years. 36. Leftover meat scramble pot. This meal had one rule: use absolutely everything. Nothing could be thrown away during WW2 meals. Like scramble pots became symbols of responsibility and survival. Everything stretched as far as possible.
By the final years of World War II, poor American families had become incredibly disciplined inside the kitchen. People measured sugar carefully, saved bacon grease inside jars, reused bread until the last crumb disappeared, and stretched ingredients farther than most modern households could even imagine. Dinner during wartime was no longer about cravings, it was about endurance. The families who survived hardest years of rationing understood one important truth: a single pot of food could carry an entire household through another day. And while many of these meals looked simple, they carried enormous emotional importance. Children remembered the smells for decades. Parents remembered the stress behind creating dinners from almost nothing. Factory workers remembered coming home exhausted and seeing steam rise from giant pots. Those moments mattered, because during difficult years, warm food became one of the few reliable comforts left inside many homes. Tonight, we continue exploring the one-pot dinners that helped poor American families survive. World War II. 37. Egg noodle cabbage pot. One of the most common wartime survival dinners was egg noodle cabbage pot. This meal exploded in popularity because noodles and cabbage remained cheap. The recipe usually started with onions frying slowly inside a deep skillet using saved grease. Then shredded cabbage entered the pot alongside egg noodles. If families could spare tiny amounts of sausage or bacon, small pieces got mixed inside for flavor. But many versions remained completely meatless. As the cabbage softened and noodles absorbed liquid, the dinner became thick, buttery-looking, and surprisingly filling. Cabbage shrinks dramatically while cooking, meaning giant piles of raw vegetables transformed into manageable portions feeding entire families. Children often complained about cabbage before dinner started, but once cooked slowly with onions and noodles, the flavor became softer and sweeter. Many mothers added pepper heavily because seasoning helped make cheap meals taste richer. Bread frequently accompanied noodle pots too. Nothing wasted. One older American later described wartime cabbage dinners by saying, "We didn't love cabbage, we just saw it constantly." 38. Cornbread milk soup. Perhaps one of the simplest wartime dinners was cornbread milk soup. Today, many Americans would barely recognize it. The process started with crumbled cornbread placed directly into bowls, then warm milk or watered-down milk poured over the bread. Some families added salt and pepper. Others added tiny amounts of sugar or syrup when available. Poorer households often used powdered milk. Children usually accepted this dinner more easily than adults because the warm, soft texture felt comforting. For parents, it meant money was tight. Warm, creamy foods created feelings of safety during stressful years. Mothers intentionally served soft, comforting meals because morale inside households mattered too. 39. Wartime chili bean pot. Chili bean pot became another major dinner because beans stretched tiny amounts of meat incredibly far. The meal usually started with onions cooking slowly alongside tiny bits of ground beef. Then came beans, kidney beans, pinto beans, tomatoes, chili powder, and water entered next before the entire pot simmered for hours. The beans absorbed flavor while thickening into heavy stew. One fascinating detail about wartime chili involved spice. Strong seasoning helped poor meals feel richer and more exciting despite limited ingredients. Crackers or bread usually accompanied chili dinners because starch stretched meals further. Some families spooned chili directly over potatoes or rice. 40. Onion potato gravy pot. This meal existed because potatoes remained one of the cheapest and most dependable foods available. Potatoes boiled until soft, onions browned slowly inside grease, flour mixed with water creating thin gravy. Everything combined together inside one pot. Simple, heavy, filling, browned onions created rich aromas strongly associated with meat cooking, even when almost no meat existed. Many older Americans remembered onion gravy dinners as last few days before payday meals during wartime financial stress. 41. Macaroni bean skillet. This meal became common because both ingredients stretched beautifully while costing far less than meat. Then macaroni, beans, tomatoes, and water entered the skillet together. As the noodles softened, they absorbed tomato flavor and bean broth. Many mothers intentionally cooked noodles longer because softer pasta absorbed more liquid and made meals feel larger. That technique stretched portions further. 42. Wartime bread and potato soup. No dinner captured wartime desperation more honestly than bread and potato soup. Stale bread pieces got torn directly into the pot alongside onions and potatoes. As the bread soaked up liquid, it thickened the soup naturally. A thick bowl of soup looked larger and more satisfying than separate tiny portions. Appearance affected morale inside the household. Dinners like this carried families through years of rationing, not because it tasted extraordinary, but because it kept families alive when little else remained.